In September 2014, Scotland went to the polls to vote on independence. However, the measure was defeated by 55 to 45%. Since then, there have been enormous changes, both in the United Kingdom and in Scotland. So where does the independence debate stand today, and what is Scotland's place in Britain, Europe and the world? To discuss all this, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Stephen Gethins, the Scottish National Party MP for Arbroath and Broughty Ferry and Professor of International Relations at St Andrews University. So hi Stephen, thanks so much for joining us. So let's just jump straight in. It's now been a decade since the referendum in Scotland. A huge amount has changed. We've had Brexit in the UK. We're seeing everything that's taking place at the moment, but it'd be really interesting to hear a little bit about how the independence debate now plays out in Scotland. What have been the changes? What are the latest current polling numbers? And what's the sense on the ground towards the idea of an independent Scotland?
Yeah, thanks for that, James. It's a pleasure to be here. I think, first of all, we are more than a decade out from the independence referendum. And we'll be coming up soon for a decade out from the Brexit, the EU referendum in the UK. And from what we've seen in polling figures, the two are still interconnected. In that, you know, I'd say to anybody listening to this that if you think referendums solve things and then they go away, forget about it. They just don't. And I think the independence referendum and the Brexit referendum have changed politics in the UK. So remember I saying this to colleagues at Westminster in the aftermath of before the Brexit referendum, saying, look, these things change politics and how people perceive things. So what we've seen since then is I don't think you can entirely separate the two out. So first of all, independence is still very much a live issue. Independence remains relatively popular. The polling shows, let's say, you know, sometimes independence is in the lead, sometimes the union's in the lead. The number of don't knows, and there are some, but they're relatively small. So independence remains a very live issue and remains something that's relatively popular. What is interesting from the EU referendum perspective is that there are, if you are pro-EU in Scotland, you're not exclusively, but you tend to be pro-independence. If you're anti-EU in Scotland, you tend to be, though not exclusively, pro-union. So we're seeing that shape that if you're pro-independence, now, incidentally, there are people who'll be listening to this saying, wait a minute, I'm pro-EU and also pro-UK. Yes, you are. And there is a significant minority of people who are like that. So I'm not, I'm not underplaying that at all. But what's interesting is the way the independence question and the EU question are so interconnected, and that if you're pro-independence, there are very, very, very few people who are pro-independence and anti-EU, if you like. And the way that I would say things have shaped up, although things change all the time in politics and it's very difficult to keep up, is that in some ways, whereas in 2014, pro-independence voices like mine were actually asking people to do something quite unique, which was, I think, what Professor Sir Neil McCormack, the late and much missed Professor Sir Neil McCormack, described as internal enlargement. You know, that way of saying what's internal enlargement, that would be you have a member state, call it the UK, and then all of a sudden from that member state, you have two member states, Scotland and the rest of the UK. That's what the independence campaign was arguing for in 2014. Obviously, that's redundant now. And the model of independence would be the same one as you have in 27 other member states. So if you like, I would argue that from a pan-European perspective, that the independence campaign has now become an awful lot more mainstream from a European perspective.
So one thing that I found really interesting was that during the heated times of the Brexit debate, which you and I both remember, it was a horrible time in the UK. It really was unpleasant. And I really felt that was a moment when a lot of people who might have not voted for independence in 2014 really reconsidered their decision. But it seems almost, and certainly just looked at, you know, from a slightly different perspective, that since Brexit has happened, that seems to have settled down. that for some reason, almost as though people have reconciled themselves to Brexit in some sort of sense. Would that seem to make sense?
So I wouldn't agree. I mean, the first thing was it was an unpleasant period, and there's a lesson there for everybody that to get losers' consent is not simply a matter of saying, you lost, we won. Losers' consent is a bit more complicated than that, and that's maybe for another discussion. But I do remember that. I do remember getting police escorts simply to do media interviews at Westminster to give my perspective. And it is worth saying for anybody who's new to this, of course, Scotland voted quite overwhelmingly, 62%, quite chunkily, in favour of remaining in the EU, whereas the UK as a whole voted quite narrowly to leave the EU. So I think that's worth it. I have to say, I'd look at Professor Sir John Curtis of Strathclyde University, who's looked at these numbers in detail. What you saw was actually support for independence has increased. Now, you never got that dramatic increase, because remember, in the aftermath of the 2016 referendum, you had the 2017 general election, when actually the SNP fell back from where they were and then advanced in the 2019 election. So I don't think, if I may, it was always as simple as that. There was so much in flux. We have seen some movement, and this is something that John Curtis talks about. There have been some pro-independence people who have gone towards the Union because maybe they don't like the European Union, but actually you've seen much more traffic going the other way of people who are pro-European Union, who are now pro-independence. Interestingly, if you look at the polling from 2014, that showed, and I'm doing this from memory, but I remember John Curtis talking very interestingly about this, if you were pro-EU or non-pro-EU, it didn't have much of a bearing on whether or not you were a yes voter or a no voter. In 2014. That's changed. It now has a dramatic impact on whether or not you'd be a pro-independence voter or not. So it's a big determining factor now, whereas in 2014 it wasn't a determining factor.
Yes, I actually remember, that it didn't map on quite as close as you suggested it does now. There were actually quite a lot of people who were pro-independence who said, we want to be truly independent and not have anything to do with the EU. Whereas there were some who were sort of like, well, I think, yes, that whole debate, of course, at the time was that, if you leave the United Kingdom, then you leave the European Union, and then look what happened 2 years later.
Yeah. So but what was interesting about the debate is that the yes, like the pro-independence side were saying, we want to be independent so we can be a more effective member state of the European Union. And if you like, the union side was saying, no, you need to remain part of the UK, so you're part of a bigger state within the European Union. Nobody was arguing, remain part of the UK so you can leave with us, or
yes,
independent so you can leave. So what was interesting is that both sides were arguing in favour of European Union membership. And it was only really on the fringes that didn't really have a huge impact on the debate that anybody was arguing against European Union membership. And I found that quite interesting, that the idea that the EU was a good thing was something that brought the two sides together, if you like.
Yes, and how and it was incredible that just 2 years later, then we saw that referendum. But Stephen, if I might, so it's quite clear that there is still a very substantial body of opinion in favour of independence. But of course, when we talk about it, it's very much in terms of a constitutional process. It's about going to the British government and saying, right, okay, this is what we want as a country. We saw, obviously, David Cameron said and reached the agreement with Nicola Sturgeon as First Minister about having that referendum. But since then, we've seen a closing up, and we saw that with successive Conservative governments. But where does the Labour Party stand now on discussions on another Scottish referendum?
So it's probably unfair of me to speak in favour of the Labour Party because I'm currently a serving SNP member of Parliament. They'd be against what they say they're against an independence referendum, but I think that begs questions. So, for example, Scotland is not, for example, or the UK, closing the name as the United Kingdom. The very definition in law of sovereignty. What does sovereignty mean? Well, it's different in Scots law than it is in English law. That's a really important distinction. And if you look at McCormack versus HMA, a really important case from, I think, 1953, this is one for anybody who wants to do a bit of digging into the ideas of sovereignty. It even goes back, right the way back to the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320. So, these things inform our constitutional law. There is no common definition of sovereignty between Scotland and England because they are distinctive entities. And that's what makes things different from, for example, Spain. Now, Labour would say we're against an independence referendum. They would also argue, maybe with some cause at the moment, because they beat the SNP in the last election. I should say, I'm an SNP MP, but Labour won that election, both in Scotland and in the rest of the UK, but that was a Westminster election. They would argue, well, there's no mandate. But that begs the question when, for example, the SNP got 56 out of 59 seats at a Westminster election, when there's a pro-independence majority within the Scottish Parliament, where does that mandate sit? And I think that often people will demand of the independence movements, well, you need to deliver on your mandate. Well, that's fine. But if you're going to have a voluntary union, and that's a term that's used by pro-union, but David Cameron's used it, Keir Starmer's used it, successive UK prime ministers have used it. Anything that is voluntary must have an exit clause. So within the European treaties, of course, we have Article 50, which can be triggered by, it's not triggered by the EU as a whole, or by the 20 or then 28 member states. Article 50, when it was triggered by an individual state through a vote of its own legislature. So what is the Article 50 within the EU? And I think it's legitimate to ask SNP and the other pro-independence parties questions of what independence might look like and how you get there. But I think similarly, it's perfectly legitimate to say to Labour or the Conservatives and the other pro-union parties, well, if there is no mandate for independence just now, what does a mandate look like? Because simply say no, even when people vote for pro-independence parties, if this is a voluntary union, there must be, it's no longer a voluntary union if there's no get-out clause.
And it's interesting because, of course, that was left really open at the time of the referendum in 2014. It was just presented as once in a generation by both sides, actually. So, I mean, I know that that's been contested by us, but I seem to remember that it wrote it that, look, this almost as a rallying call, if you don't take this chance. But it wasn't clear. But of course, you've got the interesting case of Northern Ireland, where it was a 7-year period.
And it refers to a political generation as being 7 years. And what's interesting, yeah, I mean, look, use the term, and generation was there, and that's fine. But, and also generation was never included in any legislation. So, because to put it into legislation, you would have had to have determined what that was. Now, we're now well over a decade on from the referendum. A lot's changed. But I think that, we often get into the semantics of both sides arguing about what a generation is. The Northern Irish example is a really good one. And I think it allows everybody to move forward if you have a definition. If you say, right, do you know what? If, for example, like in Northern Ireland, there is a determination that a large number of people want this, or there's a pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament, then there will be an independence referendum. Or you could do what they do, and I think in Quebec, whereby you simply say, do you know what? That is a matter for the Scottish Parliament to decide rather than the Westminster Parliament to determine. There's lots of different ways that you can do it. I think, you might expect me to think this, but I think in order to move on, you need to have some kind of definition. What are the rules of the game here? So if you're asking people to vote for something, what are the rules of the game in terms of if you vote for pro-independence? And is it just pro-independence parties? One thing that happened at the last election was the SNP got 64 out of 129 seats, so one short of an overall majority, but the Green Party got, I think, 8 seats. But they said, well, there's no majority, so they counted Green Party, who incidentally are pro-independence, seats as almost pro-union seats. But the Green Party would argue, but we're a pro-independence party and we want our votes to count towards the sort of independence majority, as it did. So all of these ways in not having rules means that we're discussing the process rather than discussing the merits or otherwise of the proposal.
So it does seem, yes, that and it, because that was left open, it has created this confusion now about when it would count. But again, it was really interesting in Northern Ireland, wasn't it, that was set out for precisely those reasons.
Yeah, so there wasn't any dubiety. And just for anybody from outside of the UK listening, the UK is not a a sort of a nation state, if you like, as others might consider themselves to be. The UK is a multinational state with multiple legal systems, and the constitution reflects that, and the clue's in the name, the United Kingdom, because it is bringing together different entities in one kingdom. So it's, yeah. So I often have to point that out for friends and colleagues from elsewhere who, for whom the constitutional aspects of the UK are sometimes a little bit misunderstood.
That actually brings on to a really, really great point that often comes up in discussions about Scottish independence, is the idea that Scotland was previously an independent entity. It was a separate kingdom and voluntarily united with England. And so there's the argument that it can reclaim its independence at any time. And I know that this has been something that there has been a wing within the Scottish independence movement which says, listen, almost like Catalonia, we should just reclaim it because it's ours to reclaim. But I know that there's a different body of opinion, which, correct me if I'm wrong, seems more mainstream, that would say, no, we need to go through a particular process, even though, yes, we were a distinct entity in the past.
So what's important here is this is where the international element is crucial. Now, you'd expect me to say this as somebody in IR and you, James, being interested. You'd expect us to say this, wouldn't you? But the international is crucial, because if you want to become independent, then the first thing you do is seek international recognition. Now, what are other states going to look at? They're going to say, well, what's the relationship like between, for example, London and Edinburgh? Have they agreed a process? And I think it's entirely legitimate for other states to be looking at that in terms of what happens. But this is where it comes back to determining what the rules are. Now, Scotland and England did enter into a treaty of union. So that's one of the basics of the UK constitutional orders, that treaty of union. But as most politicians will tell you, a democracy stops from being a democracy when you're not allowed to change your mind anymore. So at what stage could people in Scotland potentially change their minds about the union? Now, that's set out in Northern Ireland. It's set out elsewhere, but it's not set out within the United Kingdom. And I think this is one of these questions that, if you like, pro-union politicians will often fail to answer because it's a bit awkward for them, which is that if it's a voluntary union, where's that mechanism? And I think that once you get to the stage whereby London and Edinburgh have agreed a mechanism, then that makes everything else that flows from that. But Scotland is its own entity, although I have to say there are some entities in the world who recognise Scotland as being separate. You've got, for good or ill, of course, Scotland's got its own football team. And of course, and this goes back into constitutional nuance, that Scotland's also recognised separately by the Catholic Church as a filia specialis of the Church, which goes back to the declaration of Arbroath in my own constituency.
Yes, of course. And actually, so that brings on to a really interesting point, because this touches on the question of European Union membership, because if it were to be the case that, say, tomorrow Scotland were to become independent and wanted to rejoin the European Union, there's been a discussion that somehow it would face some sort of problem in doing so. And so what would be, your approach to that particular question?
So I think on that particular question, again, let's say Scotland, the UK is not one indivisible entity, as, for example, the Spanish Constitution would say that Spain was. The argument is not for me to get involved there. But for example, so it's not. So let's say, for example, London and Edinburgh reach an agreement. Scotland becomes independent through a referendum or through some other means, or let's say a referendum. London turns around. I'm using London in terms of the sort of our UK government turns around and goes, right, Scotland's now become independent, and we're sending we're going to open an embassy there in Melville Place or wherever else it happens to be in Edinburgh. It is almost inconceivable that other states would not follow suit, because where you've seen problems in the past is where one part, for example, Belgrade doesn't recognise Pristina, and therefore that causes problems. But for example, when Bratislava and Prague were recognising each other, that allowed the other states to follow suit, because, who are you to say that the organisation of this group of islands is not as it was? Similarly with Ireland, there aren't there's no example of when Ireland became independent because Dublin was recognised by London, albeit through a very different process and not, I think, it's likely to be replicated in Scotland. That was recognised very quickly as well. So one might imagine that actually a lot of the things that we talk about as being problems are not really problems. The problem comes that there is a process which is recognised within what is now the United Kingdom, or within these islands, shall we say.
Yeah, I mean, you know, for what it's worth, exactly as somebody who has worked on recognition and secession, and yeah, it's always struck me in conversations with Spanish officials and from lots of other, from the other EU members, which are more nervous about secession and independence, that their position has always been, it's the constitutionality of it that matters to us. If this is accepted, then we aren't going to stand in the way of any country becoming independent, and we'd welcome a Scotland as long as, you know, the UK will buy into this. But there is actually another side of Scottish independence and Europe, which I find fascinating, and that's the debate about the euro, because this comes up a lot, that you find that there, and I don't know whether it's a product of the very poisonous debate, if we're to be honest, in Britain about euro membership. But it does seem something that, you know, does seem to make a lot of people in Scotland think twice, or it seemed really nervous about the idea of ditching the pound, even maybe to have their own currency. But one would assume that it would actually be heading towards the euro. And I won't challenge you on the specific mechanics of a movement from the pound to the euro without an intermediate currency, and you know, which also becomes a very interesting question. But to what extent do you think that this is actually an issue amongst many voters? Because certainly from the outside, it does seem to be something that comes up.
So one thing you do when you're an active politician rather than, say, an academic, and Jim, you know, so it's something that you do which isn't terribly scientific. So you get your polls and your focus groups. But one of the things that all politicians will do is, especially in the UK and in Scotland, it's very popular, is you go around chapping doors, speaking to people. Now, that would not pass muster if you were to propose that, you know, say, well, I chapped all these doors, or that in terms of a scientific way of doing things, because, you know, it's random. What's interesting with that is it's a question that very, very rarely, if ever, gets raised. So let me look at a different way in terms of the euro. I actually looked into this, and you'll forgive the plug. I wrote a book, Nation to Nation, Scotland's Place in the World. So I look at Scottish foreign policy. I'll hold up a copy of some there. And one of the, there you go, done. One of the things, and it's a little bit out of date, but covers some of these issues. And I had some really interesting conversations around the euro. So rather than me, let me reflect on what other people told me. Neil Richmond, who is an Irish minister, is actually their minister for the diaspora at the moment, talked about, we love the euro. Why wouldn't you want the euro from an Irish perspective? Okay, now and Ireland's been very successful. I spoke to a Danish former minister now, and he said to me, look, if you're in negotiations with the EU, what are you prioritising? You know, the Danes, we prioritised, amongst other things, being outside the euro. So if you want to be outside the euro and that's your priority, or one of your priorities, then go for it. And as they said, we sit outside the euro, but sometimes we get a bit frustrated looking in. I want to stick being outside the euro, he said, but, you know. So again, the European Union is a political construct. And as a political construct, it comes up with political sort of rules and opt-outs and all the rest of it to solve political problems. And Scotland's potential euro membership is a political issue to be resolved. And from my understanding, from speaking to others who know about this process better than I do, if Scotland were to apply but said, look, we're applying, we're happy with coming in, but we want to keep our own currency, then that's something that you know, that would be perfectly open to negotiation, and something that the Commission would, I'm sure, be willing to consider. Because let's not forget as well that when I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I think this is important. We talk about things often in 2014 in terms of the independence referendum. The EU that you'd negotiate to join is not the same EU now as it would be in 2014. And this is where I think security concerns actually would trump if you'll excuse the pun, but would become more important than some of these economic considerations now, just because the world has evolved so dramatically over the past couple of years and even over the past few weeks.
And so that is a wonderful segue into sort of what I really wanted to ask you about next, which is, again, say that we woke up tomorrow and there was an independent Scotland. What would Scotland's foreign policy look like? Bearing in mind, I mean, I think people sort of erroneously think that Scotland would be a small country, but by European standards, it would be at the smaller end of what I think would be a medium-sized European country. So, it would be interesting, as I say, where would the priorities lie? And remembering, of course, as we're all seeing, it's changing almost day by day at the moment in terms of, where the world's going. I would like to talk a little bit about that more broadly in a minute, but certainly, how you would see, and assuming that if that happened, I would imagine you'd be very, very much at the front and centre of putting together that foreign policy.
So I think, first of all, one thing you touched upon there is quite important, because we always think in terms of that Scotland, from a global perspective, at about 5.5 million, sits about slap bang in the middle of the size of a UN member state, let's call it, globally. About slap bang in the middle. Similarly, from a European perspective, you're medium size, maybe slightly smaller than medium size. I think the median size of an EU state is Sweden at about 9 million or something like that. So Scotland wouldn't be that, it would be sort of in the middle of the pack. Now, there is something, though, that population size apart. One thing, when I speak to decision makers and policymakers elsewhere in Europe, privately, they've gone from talking about things like Euro, the economics and all the rest of it, which is right now, how serious is Scotland about our collective security? And one thing that, for example, Ireland's been able to get away with as a state that Scotland just wouldn't be able to get away with is one of not taking the collective security. That there's a live debate in Ireland around how much it spends, neutrality. I don't think Scotland would have that luxury. If you look at a map, Scotland sits in one of the most important geopolitical spaces in the world right now. So I think if you're Norway or Denmark or Sweden, or actually even if you're Poland or the Baltic states, you're thinking, well, we're fine with Scotland joining, but how serious are they about our security? And I think that's something you'd have to consider. That being said, things are changing so quickly, and even when this podcast or this broadcast goes out, things will evolve very quickly. But I don't think this security question is going anywhere fast. And the European democracies, and I use that term advisedly, the European democracies are having to pull more closely together. And the idea of, we used to discuss a common foreign and security policy in terms of the EU as being something kind of out there. That's now shot up the political agenda. And it's almost inconceivable that you don't have issues like interoperability with other forces as terms of your defence, for example. Your foreign policy will rightly be geared towards the rest of Europe because that's where you sit. But I think you've also got to think about other issues, diaspora, how you sit in the world. But, the European membership of the European Union will be one of if you get to independence, will be one of the drivers for independence and will be one of the priorities for an incoming Scottish foreign minister as well.
And of course, on this question, and I think, this has been given greater salience as well because of what we've seen in the past few days with Emmanuel Macron speaking about the French nuclear deterrent and used as an umbrella. And of course, it comes up so much in the debate, the security angle of the debate about Scottish independence. For people who might not know, is that the British independent deterrent is basically based out of Scotland. And this has been a really important debate in the past about what would happen to that if Scotland became independent. And I know that it's a very thorny question, but I think it's one that has become really significant, in the past few weeks.
So really important issue. I think sometimes we'll look at this through the wrong end of the telescope, and that we in Scotland have a debate and discussion about, well, what does that mean for Scotland? What do we think? Well, bear this in mind. Under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Scotland would not be the successor state. The rest of the UK would be the successor state. and therefore responsible for the nuclear weapons. Now, the added complication in that is one you correctly identify, which is the whole of the UK's nuclear deterrent sits in Scotland at the moment. But I think sometimes the military planners in Whitehall and London are going to be, look, they might not talk about it, but they are debating and discussing what you do with that. Because if your entire nuclear deterrent is based in that stage in another country, and therefore subject to the whims of the Scottish electorate, as it would be anywhere else, what do you do? Now, the SNP's policy on nuclear is very similar to that of Finland, for example, which sits in NATO, long border with Russia, a history of being way ahead of the game when it came to European security, very similar to that. There's also the question, if you're a military planner in Whitehall, of two things. One, the UK nuclear deterrent or the nuclear weapons are very tied up with the United States. So is it entirely an independent nuclear deterrent that the UK has? And that's why the question of whether or not the US is still a reliable ally is a live one in so many ways, but this one included. The other thing is that if Scottish voters, like in any other European country, determine Scottish governments, even if, and I'm not saying we should, I'm just, again, even if a Scottish government came in and said, tell you what, we'll do a deal and you can keep your nuclear weapons here, there's nothing to stop that government losing power and a new government coming in and saying, out. So I think that one of the things that's been talked about is the removal of Trident nuclear weapons as quickly and as safely as possible, because these are still weapons. And I think that an incoming government would want to negotiate in a responsible way with partners, because after all, England or the rest of the UK would remain Scotland's most important partner and ally. So these are tricky questions, but I think sometimes we look at these from the wrong end of the telescope in terms of how we're considering it.
And I was going to say, so you've just written a really, really great piece. I believe it was in the Scotsman. I sort of was reading it the weekend about making the argument that effectively what we've seen with Putin and Xi is that geopolitics now makes British membership of the European Union, of rejoining, it's got to happen, essentially. And as we know, that debate we saw with the Conservatives, it was completely toxic. They wouldn't touch it. But I think for a lot of people, there's been a disappointment that Prime Minister Starmer has also steered clear of it. How much longer do you think that can be held off? I mean, we've seen the economic effect. And, I often say that, there's several issues in international relations I don't even try to be impartial about. And Brexit is one of them. I always thought it was an absolute disaster. We've seen it played out. It was a disaster economically, but I think now we can say that strategically. But how do you shift that debate? How do you see that playing out in British politics?
So, let's take the independence issue. I've got good friends who are pro-independence, good friends who are not pro-independence. I'm pro-independence. But with respect, I have good discussions and debates with my non-independent supporting friends who I think can have good and cohesive arguments. I think they're wrong. They think I'm wrong. That's fine. On Brexit, I've yet to see a cohesive argument made in favour of the UK leaving. The stuff on the economy has come true. 4% drop in GDP, significant impact on growth, significant impact on the public finances. But crucially, right now on security, the EU is a security actor. Whether you like it or not, it's a security actor. Now, you've already got clause, I think, 42 within the treaties that has a common defence treaty between the different member states. But more than that, if Europe collectively, the situation with Russia, with the new world emerging with Trump, Putin and Xi, the response does not sit in Scotland. The response does not sit in the United Kingdom. The response does not sit in France or Germany. The response sits in Europe collectively. And that means in terms of economics, in terms of our security. So if you think about it in terms of your industrialization and rearmament strategy, and that announcement last week from Ursula von der Leyen about the 800 billion rearmament program or in the past few days, that's a really significant announcement. But similarly, so that's the hard element of it. We've seen the way the Czechs have become quite frustrated, quite rightly, about the inability of Europe with its industrial mass not to be able to supply significant armaments to the Ukrainians, whereas the North Koreans have almost been better allies to Ukraine than to Russia than we Europeans have been to one of our, another European country in Ukraine. That's a collective failure. But also from a security perspective, you've got to think about your common energy supply. So when Germany tried to turn away from Russian gas, and it'd been a long time coming, and maybe Germany should have done it a long time before, probably should have done, but they were able to switch off that Russian gas relatively quickly. Food and drink security, which is another really important element, again, being part of that single market, is a crucial area. So in a time of blocks, when you've got the United States, China and Russia acting as a bloc, there is security and safety in a bloc of common European democracies coming more closely together. And even, for example, Canada, developing its relationship. For the UK to be sitting outside that at this time, I would argue, is grossly irresponsible and unsustainable. I mean, it's to the extent in terms of what's going on, you're pushing water uphill. Eventually, the United Kingdom is going to have to rejoin. And in my opinion, the sooner the better, and the closer you can get, the better.
But how do you see a particular inflection point coming up sort of relatively soon that Starmer, because the pressure does seem to be growing from all quarters. And as I say, I think, everything that we're seeing with Trump at the moment and the way that the debate has changed, but he I think since coming to power, I mean, he's earned a lot of plaudits these past month or so. But there is still, I think, a lot of frustration that he just doesn't seem to be touching on this. And from an economic point of view as well, that just that sense of leveling with the British people and just saying, listen, we've got ourselves in a hole and we've just got to admit to ourselves that it's Brexit related. I'm going to start digging us out, but I'm going to have to deal with this issue. And I just don't know how, in speaking, how you see it, but in speaking with colleagues as to if that is possible for him to do, or and how long it might take before he just gives in to what I think many of us now see as the inevitable.
So there has been this idea of omerta around the impact of Brexit. And I'm sorry to say, even amongst broadcasters, in terms of what's been going on.
Absolutely, yeah.
I've been doing broadcasts, and I talk about the customs union that you can do pretty quick. It gives you an immediate boost to growth as an alternative to some of the cuts for defence spending, for example. And it's like, oh, that's not really on the table. And I says, well, it should be. And we should be talking about it. Because even if you disagree with that, then set out why. Set out how you can meet these challenges. Because the UK has become an exception within European democracies and pulling away from the European bloc. And it hasn't been successful. And we are yet to see a cohesive argument. Now, I can see from a UK perspective, it's easier in Scotland. We vote in favour of the European Union. The numbers are high. But even at a UK perspective, the numbers are really quite high in terms of wanting to rejoin and at least membership of the customs union and the single market, incidentally, that were never on the ballot paper. I have to say, and I've got a huge amount of respect for colleagues in other parties, but I have to say I think this is, as I said earlier on, grossly irresponsible. But this is where there has to be a voice for business, security sector, and others. Because I think one thing the UK is going to have to come to terms with, from a London perspective, you persistently hear about the proximity of that relationship with the United States. And I'm not denying that's been a really important relationship. But I'm not sure you can continue to call it a reliable partnership when the United States votes with Russia and China and all these really unpleasant states on whether or not Russia's waging a war of aggression. That seems that's really striking. Or when the United States stops supplying military aid, or when it switches off the satellite assistance, which is costing Ukrainian lives. So at that stage, there has to be a cultural shift, and they're always the most difficult. There has to be a cultural shift, if you like, within the UK establishment, that relationship is unreliable, and pitching back in with European democracies that are similar, common values, that are approaching this challenge of security in Ukraine in a similar way. And incidentally, something the Brexiteers keep forgetting about is right there, the UK is part of the continent of Europe, you can't deny geography, is something that there needed to be a wake-up call years ago. But I think the events of the past few weeks should have set that right up the political agenda. But I would be encouraging any businesses or other stakeholders listening to this. It's not just people like me that need to make the case, but everybody needs to make the case.
Stephen, look, thank you so much. In fact, that was going to be my last question, but you touched on it really, really well there. Exactly that sort of, where the British foreign policy should be going. I want to say an absolutely huge thanks for joining us. It's been great, and I know many viewers be terribly interested to know about what's happened with the debate in Scotland. But it's very clear that it is live. And I think, with everything that's going on at the moment, it's going to be a fascinating time in politics, in European politics, British politics, Scottish politics in the weeks. I was about to say years ahead, but it is going to be weeks ahead. Thanks so much again. Really, really appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you.